My name is Talia, and I'm 26 years old. I still remember the moment everything in my family quietly fell apart just days before Thanksgiving. It started with a phone call from my mom that sounded strangely cold, the kind of voice people use when they've already made a decision about you. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, staring at the grocery list I had been making for the trip home, when she said something that made my heart drop. My mom said, "You won't be at Thanksgiving this year. Your sister's new husband thinks you'd ruin the vibe." For a few seconds, I thought I had misheard her. Ruin the vibe? I asked her what she meant, but she just sighed, like she was tired of the conversation before it even started. She told me that my sister's new husband, Ethan, felt uncomfortable around me, and that since this was his first Thanksgiving with the family, they didn't want drama. Drama? I barely even knew the guy. I had met him exactly twice, once at their rushed wedding dinner and once at a short family brunch where he barely spoke to me. Still, somehow, I had already become the problem. I stood there, gripping my phone, while my mom kept explaining things as if it were perfectly reasonable to uninvite your own daughter from a holiday. She said it would only be this year, and that maybe next year things would feel different. But what hurt the most wasn't even the excuse. It was how easily everyone seemed to agree with it. My sister hadn't called me, my dad hadn't called me. It was like they had all quietly decided I didn't belong at the table anymore. I felt that heavy, familiar feeling I'd had growing up, the one where I somehow ended up being the odd one out in my own family. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to ask what exactly Ethan had said about me. But the truth was, I already knew how those conversations went. If I pushed, they'd say I was proving his point. So instead, I did the one thing no one expected. I said nothing. I just told my mom I understood and ended the call. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the silence pressing in around me. Outside, the city was already glowing with early holiday lights, but inside my chest, it felt dark and hollow. I kept replaying those words in my mind. You won't be at Thanksgiving this year. It sounded less like a request and more like a verdict. Eventually, anger replaced the sadness. Who was Ethan to decide whether I belonged in my own family? And more importantly, why were they letting him? I tried to remember our short interactions. At the wedding dinner, he had watched me strangely when I mentioned where I worked, like the information had caught him off guard. At brunch, he had asked me a few careful questions about my job, my office, my position, questions that felt less like curiosity and more like he was trying to confirm something. At the time, I brushed it off as awkward small talk. Now, lying awake in the dark, I wondered if there had been something else in his expression, something like recognition or fear. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I hadn't done anything to this man. I didn't even know him well enough to offend him. By midnight, I had convinced myself to stop caring. If my family didn't want me there, fine. I'd make my own plans for Thanksgiving. I'd cook something simple, maybe watch movies, maybe even take a short trip somewhere quiet. I told myself I was okay with it, but deep down, the rejection still stung like a fresh bruise. The next morning, I went to work determined to push the whole thing out of my mind. My office building downtown was already buzzing when I walked in, the usual morning rush of employees, ringing phones, and the smell of coffee drifting through the halls. Work had always been the one place where things felt steady and predictable. I liked that. I liked being someone people relied on instead of someone they excluded. I had just settled at my desk and opened my laptop when my assistant knocked lightly on the door. She looked a little confused. "Talia," she said carefully, "there's a man in reception asking for you. He says it's urgent." I frowned. I wasn't expecting any meetings that morning. "Did he give a name?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Ethan." My stomach tightened instantly. What was my sister's husband doing here? For a moment, I wondered if something had happened to my sister or my parents, but my assistant didn't look worried, just puzzled. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked out toward reception, my thoughts racing with questions. When I turned the corner and saw him standing there, he looked nothing like the calm, polite guy I had met at the wedding. He looked tense, almost panicked. The second his eyes landed on me, his face went pale, like he had just seen a ghost. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then suddenly, everything exploded at once. His chair screeched loudly against the floor as he shot to his feet, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. And right there, in the middle of my office reception area, with employees turning to watch in confusion, he started screaming. Because the moment Ethan saw me standing in the reception area of my office, his entire body froze, like he had just walked into a nightmare he never expected to see. For a second, the whole room went silent, except for the faint humming of computers and the distant ringing of phones. Then suddenly, his chair screeched backwards as he jumped to his feet, staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. And right there, in front of my staff and half the people waiting in the lobby, he started screaming, because he had just realized exactly who I was. No, this can't be right," he muttered first, shaking his head as if he were trying to wake himself up from a bad dream. But when I stepped a little closer, confused and trying to understand what was happening, his panic only grew worse. You work here?" he blurted out, his voice cracking. I frowned. "Yes, I do. Why are you here?" The receptionist, my assistant, and several employees were staring between us, clearly sensing something strange unfolding. Ethan looked around the office lobby again, noticing the company logo on the wall, the security badges, the staff quietly watching us. His breathing grew faster, and suddenly his voice dropped into a whisper that sounded almost horrified. "You're Talia Morgan, the compliance director." I blinked. Yes. The moment I confirmed it, his face completely drained of color. His hands began shaking so badly he had to grab the back of the chair beside him. And then he said the one sentence that made the entire situation make sense. "Oh my God, your sister didn't know." At that point, I wasn't confused anymore. I was irritated. "Know what?" I asked firmly. Ethan swallowed hard. "She didn't know you were the person investigating my company." The air in the room suddenly felt heavy. For a second, even I just stared at him, processing the words. Because yes, it was true. I was leading an internal regulatory investigation into a mid-sized financial consulting firm suspected of fraudulent reporting. It was a complicated case that had been quietly developing for months, but I had never once heard Ethan mention where he worked in detail. At the wedding dinner, he had simply said he worked in financial consulting. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, everything clicked into place all at once. The strange looks he had given me, the careful questions about my job, the tension every time our paths crossed. Ethan ran both hands through his hair in complete panic. "When I saw your name at the wedding guest list, I thought it was just a coincidence," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "But then I saw you again at brunch and I started worrying. I asked your sister what you did and she said you worked in corporate compliance, but she didn't know details. I thought if you came around the family too much, you might figure out where I worked." I crossed my arms slowly, letting him keep talking. "So you told my family I'd ruined the vibe at Thanksgiving?" I asked. He looked ashamed, but nodded. "I just needed distance. If you started asking questions, if you connected the company name, I could lose everything." The irony of the situation was almost unbelievable. My own family had cut me off from Thanksgiving because my sister's new husband was afraid I might accidentally discover something illegal he was involved in. But what Ethan didn't realize yet was the part that truly terrified him. I looked him straight in the eyes and said calmly, "Ethan, the investigation already connected the dots last week." His face completely collapsed. "What?" "Your company name came up in a financial audit. We've already pulled the records." He looked like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His voice dropped into a desperate whisper. "You're going to report it?" I didn't answer immediately. I simply studied him. The man who had convinced my own family to exclude me just to protect himself. The man who thought pushing me away would stop the truth from catching up with him. Finally, I spoke. "That depends on what the records show," I said evenly. "But I suggest you start preparing for some very serious questions." At that moment, Ethan looked less like a confident new husband and more like a man realizing the consequences of his choices were already closing in. He had come to my office that morning hoping to confirm whether I was the same Talia he feared. Instead, he had walked straight into the worst possible confirmation. After a long silence, he nodded weakly, muttered a quiet apology, and walked out of the lobby, looking like someone heading toward a storm he couldn't escape. The moment the doors closed behind him, my assistant turned to me slowly with wide eyes. "Do I even want to know what that was about?" she asked. I exhaled and shook my head with a faint smile. "Not today." But later that evening, sitting alone again in my apartment, I thought about the strange twist of fate. My family believed I was the one who would ruin Thanksgiving. But the truth was, the only reason Ethan was afraid of me was because he already knew what he had done. And sometimes the truth has a way of showing up exactly where people least expect.